Worthless. That's what this is, and what you are. The red marks bled through the paper like wounds that wouldn't heal. Ethan Calloway sat in the cold silence of his father's study, the heavy oak desk towering between them like a wall. Across its polished surface lay the test papers, 7 of them, each bearing a single, devastating letter in thick red ink. F. They looked like verdicts. Final, unchangeable. Richard Calloway didn't glance at his son. He stood by the tall window, framed in gold drapes, his arms crossed, his profile sharp and motionless. Beyond him, the vast estate rolled out in manicured green hills, a world of order and power. Inside, Ethan's hands trembled. "I gave you everything," Richard said at last, his voice quiet but cutting. "The tutors, the specialists, the schools. And this is what you bring me?" Ethan didn't speak. He couldn't. F in literature, F in math, F in science. What exactly do you know, Ethan? He turned now, slowly, his blue eyes scanning the boy with the same distant appraisal he gave company reports. "What do you do with all that time in your room? Play games? Watch cartoons? Daydream?" Ethan lowered his eyes. He wanted to say something, but words never came easily, not the way they came for other kids. Letters jumbled, lines swam. Every sentence was a maze, and every book a battlefield. He wasn't lazy. He tried, but the words never stayed still. "You are the heir to this name," Richard said. "Do you understand that? I built Calloway Ventures from the ground up. I've sat in rooms with presidents, closed billion-dollar deals, and I'm supposed to trust all of that to a boy who can't pass a middle school grammar test?" Ethan's throat tightened. Richard walked over, placed one finger on the top page, and dragged it toward his son. "Read it," he said. Ethan stared at the first line. The letters flickered. The red marks circled phrases he couldn't remember writing. His lips moved, but no sound came. "I said, read it out loud." The words pulsed and doubled. Was that an N or an H? He blinked hard. I can't," he whispered. Richard slammed the table. "Worthless. That's what this is, and what you are." The silence afterward was like a vacuum. Ethan's eyes burned, but he didn't cry. He had stopped crying years ago. Maybe around the time his mother left. Maybe before. Richard stood up straight, brushing imaginary dust from his cufflinks. "You leave Monday." Ethan looked up, startled. "I've already called Blackridge Academy. They take boys who need discipline. You'll be on a plane first thing in the morning. I won't have failure sleeping under my roof." "But," Ethan finally spoke, a breathy whisper, "it's not that I don't try." Richard was already walking away. Trying is for amateurs. Results are what matter. And then he was gone, leaving Ethan in the study with the red letters and the echo of a sentence that would live inside him far longer than any school assignment. The estate was silent that night. No one came to check on him. Not the butler, not the cook, not even the rotating door of tutors who paraded in and out of his life, each one giving up a little faster than the last. In this house, people didn't stay. Ethan sat on the floor by his bed, the test papers scattered around him. He didn't want to pack. He didn't want to sleep. He just wanted silence. A silence that didn't hurt. He took a pencil and tried to write his name, slowly, carefully. But the A came out backward again. He tore the paper and curled up on the floor. Downstairs, in a much smaller room at the far end of the servants' wing, Marissa Johnson unpacked a folded uniform from her modest suitcase. Her hands were quick, practiced, but her shoulders carried a stillness, one that life had taught her to wear like armor. The Calloway mansion was the third home she'd worked in that year. Big houses didn't scare her, nor did cold employers. What unsettled her most were the silences, the ones that wrapped around children like fog, making them forget what warmth sounded like. She hadn't met Ethan yet. She was told not to speak unless spoken to. She cleans, she leaves, that's it. Don't talk to the staff, the house manager had warned. But the moment she saw the discarded test papers in the trash the next morning, folded, then torn, then crumpled again, something inside her stirred. The name at the top was crooked, the handwriting hesitant. Letters swam across the page, unevenly spaced, as if fleeing before they could be caught. She knew that writing. She had once written like that, too. At breakfast, Ethan sat alone, pushing scrambled eggs across the plate. Richard was on a call. The staff passed through like shadows, heads down, no one meeting the boy's eye, except Marissa. Just for a moment, she paused by the dining room door. She wasn't supposed to look, but she did. Ethan glanced up, met her eyes, and then quickly looked away, as if punished for it. That was the first time he saw her, and the first time she knew she wouldn't be able to stay silent forever. That night, after dishes were done and the halls grew quiet, Marissa walked past the study and noticed a light still on. The door was cracked open. She saw him, alone again, curled over a torn paper, trying to write the word because. The letters kept breaking apart. He gripped the pencil so hard it snapped. Marissa exhaled softly. There was a time when her own hands had trembled over the alphabet, when her teachers had called her slow, useless, broken. They hadn't known the panic that came with every spelling test, the dread of every paragraph. They hadn't cared to ask why. But one person had, her mother. Her mother, who had taught her how to trace words with rhythm, who used music, touch, color, who refused to give up. And now, here was this boy, another child that the world had already begun to discard. Marissa reached into her pocket and touched the folded handkerchief her mother had embroidered with her initials. She wasn't going to speak tonight, not yet, but she wasn't going to walk away either. The next morning, Ethan's suitcase sat by the door. The car would take him to the airport in 2 hours. No one said goodbye. No one asked what he wanted. But when he opened his backpack, he found a single folded sheet of paper placed gently between the books. It wasn't from his father. It wasn't from a tutor. It was written in thick marker, the letters big and spaced apart, the kind you might find on a kindergarten poster. You are not stupid. Your brain just learns differently. Try reading this out loud, one word at a time. I'm rooting for you. M. No name, no praise, just permission. Ethan didn't smile, but for the first time in years he read something and didn't feel afraid. She cleans, she leaves. That's it. Don't talk to the staff. The first time Marissa Johnson stepped foot into the Calloway mansion, no one looked at her face. Not the driver who picked her up from the staff entrance. Not the assistant who handed her a clipboard full of instructions. Not the head housekeeper who only said, "Your quarters are upstairs, third door on the right. Uniforms are ironed and labeled. Stick to the schedule." Marissa was used to being invisible. In fact, she preferred it that way. She cleaned. She left. That was the rule. What people didn't know was that she had learned how to see everything while being seen by no one. In her first week, she learned the layout of the house without needing a map. She learned the way the sunlight fell differently in each room, the cold silver of the east windows at dawn, the golden warmth in the library around 3. She learned that Richard Calloway preferred his coffee black, exactly 182 degrees, served at 6:45 a.m. sharp. And she learned that his son, Ethan, never finished a full meal. Ethan. There was something in the way he walked, head slightly down, shoulders rounded, always carrying a book bag too big for his frame, always silent, always alone. He never looked up at her, not even once. But she saw the paper cuts on his fingertips from pages he tore out in frustration. She saw the pencil marks on his palms from holding on too tightly. She saw the traces of erased words on his desk that didn't quite disappear. And she saw the pain, quiet, constant, invisible. Pain she knew too well. Marissa had been like him once. When she was 9, she stood at the front of her classroom for a spelling test. The word was beginning. She stared at the letters, but they wouldn't line up. The G flipped in her head, the N multiplied, and the teacher's voice drummed louder than the letters themselves. She spelled it wrong, twice. The teacher called her slow in front of the class. A boy laughed and said she must be broken. It stuck, like glue. She didn't know then that she had dyslexia. No one tested for it in the neighborhood schools. They just said she was lazy, distracted, not trying hard enough. She started believing it too, until her mother, sweet, soft-spoken Evelyn Johnson, pulled her out of school and taught her to read using music, tracing letters in sand, tapping rhythms into her palms, teaching her to feel the shape of words before ever seeing them. Evelyn was a janitor, a single mother, and an artist with no gallery. But what she gave Marissa was a miracle. She gave her the right to learn in her own way. And now, all these years later, Marissa stood in the same position her mother once did, watching a child struggle with letters the world demanded he master on command. Only this time, it wasn't a public school in East Baltimore. It was a marble-floored mansion with priceless art on the walls, and a boy born into privilege who still lived in a cage of shame. On her 3rd day, she noticed a detail no one else would have seen. Ethan's notebook was upside down. He sat at the breakfast table while his father skimmed through market news. No one said anything. No one looked. But Marissa did. His fingers trembled over the page, and every now and then his mouth formed a silent word. She couldn't hear it, but she could see the fight and the fear. She almost stepped forward. Almost. But the voice of the house manager echoed in her head. Don't talk to the family. Clean and go. So instead, she waited. She waited through one spilled tray of juice that no one apologized for. She waited through an awkward lunch where Ethan dropped a fork and froze as if expecting punishment. She waited until the day she passed his room while vacuuming and heard a sound that didn't match the house. It wasn't music. It wasn't shouting. It was the sound of paper tearing slowly, like someone trying not to scream. She paused. She turned off the vacuum, and she listened. Then, quietly, she knocked. There was no answer. She waited, then opened the door. Ethan sat on the floor, surrounded by shreds of notebook pages. He looked up, startled, eyes wide like a deer cornered in headlights. He had a pencil in one hand and a crumpled test in the other. Marissa said nothing. She only stepped in slowly, bent down and picked up a piece of paper that hadn't been completely destroyed. She looked at it. A few words survived. I don't know why I can't. That was all, but it was enough. She met his eyes, and for the first time she spoke, not as a maid, not as staff, but as someone who understood. You grip that pencil like it owes you something, she said gently. Ethan didn't respond. His hands curled tighter. Marissa didn't push. She only laid the page gently on the table and said, You don't have to fight the words. You just need someone to show you how to catch them. And then, without waiting for permission or praise, she left the room. That was the first crack in the wall. Later that night, Ethan found that same page on his pillow. The corners had been smoothed. The tear marks had been taped. And at the bottom was a note in large, printed letters. Try again. One word at a time. Tomorrow is a clean page. no name. But he knew who it was, and for the first time, he didn't crumple it. Downstairs in the laundry room, Marissa sat on a stool beside the dryer, staring at nothing. In her pocket was a tiny scrap of cloth, an old bookmark her mother had embroidered. She rubbed it between her fingers, remembering the feel of her mother's fingers guiding hers along the alphabet, tapping rhythms into her hand, whispering, "You're not broken, baby. You're just tuned differently." She never forgot those words. And she wasn't going to let Ethan forget them either. Not if she could help it. The next morning, Ethan hesitated before stepping into the dining room. Marissa was setting the table. He lingered in the doorway. She glanced up, gave the tiniest nod. He walked in. And for the first time since he could remember, he chose to sit facing the sunlight. Not the shadow you grip that pencil like it owes you something. The page looked smooth from a distance, but Ethan knew its surface was a battlefield. He stared at the blank sheet, the lines sharp and unyielding. The moment his pencil touched the paper, it would begin. Another war between his thoughts and the twisted trail of letters that refused to march in order. He hated writing, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because the words refused to stay. He gripped the pencil tighter. Outside his bedroom, the autumn wind brushed dry leaves against the windows like fingertips. Inside, the silence pressed against him, thick and unwelcome. One line. That's all he had to write. Just one sentence. A summary of a short story from school. He had read it twice, out loud, the way Marissa's note had told him to. He whispered the words, touching each syllable with his lips. He even understood it. But when he tried to write, nothing came out right. He wrote the first 3 words, then crossed them out. Tried again. Misspelled the 4th word, then scratched out the whole line in frustration. His eraser tore the paper. His hand started to sweat. That's when he slammed the pencil down and pressed his fists into his temples. "I'm not stupid," he whispered, as if saying it would make it true. Then the door creaked, and he flinched. Marissa stood in the hallway, her arms full of folded towels, just passing by, or at least pretending to. She didn't mean to intrude, but that whisper caught her. The desperation in it. The voice of a child trying to prove his own worth to a room that didn't believe in him. She knocked lightly. "May I?" Ethan froze. "No one's here," she added. "Just me." He didn't say anything, but he didn't tell her to leave either. Marissa stepped in slowly and placed the towels on a nearby chair. Her eyes moved gently to the desk, the torn paper, the crooked pencil. She noticed the marks on his fingers again, little calluses forming in places most boys his age didn't have. "You grip that pencil like it owes you something," she said softly. Ethan didn't answer. He looked down, embarrassed. She stepped closer, careful not to startle him. Not too close, not towering, just near enough for her voice to land gently. "Want to tell me what the paper did to deserve that kind of attack?" she asked, smiling faintly. Ethan let out a sound, almost a huff, but it wasn't angry. Just tired. He didn't mean to speak, but the words slipped out. "I can't do it right." Marissa nodded slowly, not correcting him, not interrupting. She didn't say, "Of course you can." She didn't say, "Try harder." Instead, she knelt down so they were eye level. "Show me what you see." Ethan blinked. "What?" "The words. What do they look like when you read them?" He looked at her, unsure whether she was mocking him. But her eyes weren't cold. They were curious, warm, safe. He hesitated, then pointed to the page. "This," he said. "It's supposed to say the boy went to the river. But when I read it again, the R and the V switch. Sometimes the W floats. And I forget which way the B goes. It just moves. Marissa breathed in slowly, almost reverently. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For showing me. That takes courage." No one had ever said that before. Courage? For messing up letters? Ethan didn't understand. She looked at the paper again. "Do you know what this looks like to me?" He shook his head. "A mirror maze. The kind you walk into and suddenly you don't know which way is real. That's what letters can feel like. Right?" Ethan nodded slowly. A tear threatened the corner of his eye, but he blinked it back. Boys didn't cry, especially not in front of staff. But Marissa didn't make him feel like a boy who needed to cry. She made him feel like someone who didn't have to hide. She stayed only a few minutes that day. Didn't push, didn't pry, just pulled a sticky note from her apron pocket, wrote the word river on it in big printed letters and said, "Let's start with this. Say it, feel it, trace it." Then she left it beside his notebook. That night, Ethan said the word 10 times before bed. He traced it with his finger, and when the lights went out, he whispered it once more, as if anchoring it into the space between memory and hope. The next afternoon, Marissa passed by the pantry and overheard 2 maids whispering. "The new girl thinks she can teach the Calloway boy? Please. Someone should tell her to stay in her lane. His father'll lose it if he finds out." Marissa didn't stop walking. She just carried the tray of glasses through the kitchen, past the hallway, and into the living room where Ethan sat alone again, a book on his lap, untouched. She placed a glass of water beside him. "You thirsty?" He shook his head, but the gesture was softer than usual. "Want to try a new word today?" she asked, kneeling next to the coffee table. He didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. She opened a notepad and wrote the word path in big, even strokes. "Your turn." Ethan frowned but took the pencil. He wrote it slowly. The A came out backward, the T too tall, the H was almost a B. He looked ready to tear it up, but Marissa stopped his hand with her own. "No, we don't throw away first tries here. We learn from them." She turned the paper slightly. "Look, the letters are like people in a line. You just need to tell them where to stand." Ethan blinked. "People?" "Yep. Some are loud like capital P. Some are shy like lowercase a. But they're all listening to you. You're the teacher now." He looked at the word again, seeing it differently. "Try again," she said. This time he did. Every day that week, Ethan met her for 5 minutes in a different room. Sometimes the kitchen, sometimes the back porch, sometimes just outside the library. They called it the quiet minutes. No books, just one word at a time. And when she had to clean, he would sit nearby, tracing letters in flour on the counter or tapping syllables with a spoon. It wasn't school. It wasn't even formal. But it was the first time Ethan began to see letters not as enemies, but as puzzle pieces he could eventually fit. By the end of the week, he wrote 3 full sentences by himself. No one else saw. Not his father, not the staff, not his teachers. But Marissa saw. And when Ethan looked up at her after writing, unsure and anxious, she simply said, "You did that." And those 3 words landed deeper than any red mark ever could. A maid thinks she can teach the Calloway heir? Fire her. The pantry wasn't a place for secrets, but it held more of them than the master bedroom. It was narrow, always cool, lined with imported goods, spices, silver trays, and a silence no one paid attention to, except when they wanted to whisper. And on Tuesday morning, the whispers had turned sharp. "I'm telling you, she's crossing a line." She sits with him like she's his tutor. His father has no idea. When he finds out... Marissa stood by the freezer, her hand still resting on a bag of frozen peas. She didn't turn around. She didn't move. She just listened. "She's sweet," said one younger housemaid. "I think the boy likes her." "That's not her job," hissed the older one. "And it's not your place to say otherwise." The footsteps faded. Marissa took a breath and closed the freezer. She had heard it before. She'd heard it in different kitchens, with different accents, behind different uniforms. "You're just the help. You don't belong in their world. You'll only make things worse." But they never saw what she saw. They didn't know what it meant when a child who used to flinch at his own name now traced letters into his toast with jelly. Or when a boy who once curled into himself in silence now whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, "Can we do 2 words today?" They didn't see the victories. They only saw the boundaries. Ethan was already waiting for her when she entered the sunroom. He sat cross-legged on the floor, a notepad on his lap, pencil in hand. Today the word was understand, a hard one. Long, wobbly, too many shapes. But he didn't hesitate. He began to write, slowly, carefully. The U leaned too far to the left, the D was reversed, but the A was perfect. The N stood tall. Marissa watched silently, sitting beside him on the rug, her knees touching the cold tile. When he finished, he looked up, his eyes searching hers not for approval, but for honesty. She nodded. "It's not perfect," she said gently. "But it's brave." Ethan looked down at the page again. Then, without tearing it up, he wrote it again. Braver. But the house was never truly silent. Nothing in a mansion that large stayed hidden for long. It started with the butler, a stiff man with polished shoes and a clipboard for a spine. He passed by the sunroom one morning and paused. "Miss Johnson," he said curtly, "may I remind you your responsibilities do not include child instruction?" Marissa stood up. "Yes, sir." "That includes limiting personal interaction with the family." "Yes, sir." She didn't argue. She didn't have to. Ethan had already hidden the notepad under the cushion. But that moment changed everything. Because when Ethan watched her walk away, something stirred in him, a thread pulling tighter. Not fear, not shame, something else. The beginning of loyalty. 2 days later, Ethan asked to meet in the laundry room instead. "No windows there," he said. Marissa tilted her head. "You sure?" He nodded. "People stare." She smiled faintly. "All right then." In the warm, humming room where sheets spun behind glass and the scent of fabric softener hung in the air, Ethan sat on a stool and spelled out the word light. And it was the first time he didn't switch the G and the H. "Light," he said softly. "Like you." Marissa blinked. "What do you mean?" "You make the words not so dark anymore." She couldn't answer for a moment. Her throat caught. She wasn't used to being seen, especially not by someone so small. That night, while cleaning the hallway outside Richard Calloway's study, she overheard the butler again. "She's been interfering. The boy's too attached. It's becoming a distraction." A pause. A sigh. Richard's voice replied, "He needs structure, not coddling. She may mean well, but it's beyond her station. A maid teaching the heir." Another pause. "Fire her!" Marissa's hand tightened around the cloth. She finished polishing the door. Then she walked back to the servants' wing with her head high, her steps even. But her chest burned. Not for herself. for the boy who was finally learning to breathe. The next day, she didn't come to the sunroom, or the laundry room, or the back porch. Ethan waited, and waited. And when she didn't come, he felt something unfamiliar surge inside him, like fear, but not quite. More like a sinking. He found her by accident that evening, folding towels in the linen closet. "You're mad at me," he said. She looked up, startled. "No, baby." "Never." "Then why didn't you come today?" She hesitated, then knelt down so they were level. "Because sometimes doing the right thing makes other people uncomfortable, and I didn't want to get you in trouble." "You're not in trouble. I am." He looked away. "I always mess things up." Marissa touched his hand gently. "No," she said. "You are not the problem. Their rules are." Ethan didn't quite understand that, but he liked the way it sounded. Like something was wrong with the world, not with him. That night, he snuck into her supply closet and left a folded paper on her cart. On it, in messy pencil strokes, were just 2 words. "Keep coming." And she did. Quietly. Secretly. Like the way music slips under a closed door. They met in smaller moments now, in 5-minute windows between chores, in silent nods, in quick glances across the room. She taught him by gesture, by rhythm, by touch. Tap once for a consonant. Twice for a vowel. She whispered phrases while folding sheets. He traced letters in the condensation on a window pane. They were building something, word by word, and no one could stop it. By the end of the month, Ethan wrote an entire paragraph on his own. It was uneven, clumsy, some letters backward, but it was his. Marissa didn't say good job. She said, "You found your way through." And he beamed. But outside the pantry walls, the storm was building. One whisper turned into 2, then into a murmur, then a knock on her door. Late at night, it was the butler. "Mr. Calloway would like to speak with you in the study, now." She rose slowly, tucked her shirt in, and walked through the house like she belonged there. Because maybe, just maybe, she finally believed it. Did she touch my son's mind without my permission? The classroom was still when Ethan placed his paper on the teacher's desk. He didn't look at anyone. Not the boys who whispered when he passed, not the girl who laughed last week when he couldn't spell question, not even the teacher who had once sighed loudly enough for everyone to hear. He just placed the paper down and returned to his seat. But his fingers trembled under the desk. It was the first time he hadn't left a section blank, the first time he'd finished a full written response. And he hadn't cheated. He'd done it slowly, carefully, tracing words with his lips before writing them down the way Marissa taught him. 1 breath per syllable. 1 tap per vowel. He knew he had spelled a few things wrong, but he also knew, deep down, that it was real. His work, his voice, his truth. The next day, the whispers started before the first bell rang. The teacher stood at the front of the room, holding Ethan's paper like it was a riddle she couldn't solve. "This is quite an improvement," she said slowly, eyes narrowed. "Remarkable, actually." The class turned to look at Ethan. He shrank into his seat. "This isn't your handwriting," she added. "Did someone help you?" Ethan's ears burned. "No." The word came out like a question, not a defense. "I'll need to verify this," she said, placing the paper aside and calling the next student. That night, Ethan didn't eat dinner. He sat on the edge of his bed, paper clenched in his hand, the red check marks circling correct answers like targets. What had felt like victory now felt like a trap. He had tried, and now they were calling it cheating. The next morning, a black car pulled into the Circle Drive earlier than usual. Inside the mansion, Richard Calloway stood in his private office, holding the same paper in one hand and a mug of untouched coffee in the other. His assistant stood stiffly across from him. "You're sure this is his?" "Yes, sir. The teacher emailed late last night." "She was concerned." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Concerned about what?" "About the possibility of academic dishonesty. It's inconsistent with his prior work." Richard turned the paper over. The writing was neat, but not perfect. The ideas were sound, but the grammar still clumsy. But there was something raw in it. Something authentic. He hadn't seen that before. He turned slowly to his butler, who stood nearby. "Get him." Ethan was brought to the study like a criminal awaiting sentencing. He stood before his father, head down, hands clenched. "Where did you get this?" Richard asked, holding up the paper. "I wrote it." "By yourself?" Ethan nodded. "Don't lie to me, Ethan." "I didn't lie." "You expect me to believe that a child who's failed every written assignment for 2 years suddenly produced this? With no help?" Ethan said nothing. His eyes burned, but he refused to blink. Richard exhaled sharply. "Was it the new tutor? Did someone sneak in work for you? Is this a prank?" "It was me," Ethan said again. "Just me." But Richard didn't believe him. He walked to the intercom, pressed a button. "Bring Miss Johnson to my study." Marissa arrived minutes later, wiping her hands on her apron, the scent of lemon cleaner still clinging to her sleeves. She stood in the doorway, her face calm but unreadable. "You asked for me, sir?" Richard turned. He held up the paper like evidence. "Did you touch my son's mind without my permission?" The room froze. Marissa blinked once, then stepped forward. "I didn't touch him, sir. I listened." "Did you teach him?" "I answered questions. When he asked, I showed him another way to see the letters." "That's not your job." "No, sir." "Then why do it?" She looked at Ethan. He was trembling now, fists clenched at his sides, eyes wide. "Because," she said gently, "he was drowning, and no one noticed." Richard's jaw tensed. "This is my house," he said, voice low. "You don't make decisions here. I pay you to clean floors, not mines." Marissa straightened her back. "I understand, sir." "You went behind my back." "I didn't go behind anyone," she replied. "Your son was already behind. I just walked beside him." That made Richard pause. The room was silent, until Ethan took a step forward. "She didn't cheat." His voice was small, but steady. "She helped me learn to try." Richard turned slowly to face him. "She is not your teacher. She's the only one who ever taught me something that made sense." Richard flinched. The words struck harder than he expected. There was no anger in Ethan's voice, just truth. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then he pointed to the door. "You're dismissed." Ethan hesitated. "I said go." The boy walked out, his steps faster than before, but he didn't look back. Richard turned to Marissa. "You'll leave by morning. We'll settle your pay." Marissa said nothing. She simply nodded, then looked around the study once, taking in the fine mahogany shelves, the glint of gold trim, the towering glass windows, and said quietly, "I hope you notice him before it's too late." Then she left, not with shame, but with dignity. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat on the floor beside his bed, pages of scribbled words around him. His hands were shaking again. The world was tilting again. She was gone. Because of him. He found the drawer, the one where he'd kept every sticky note she ever wrote. Words like River, path, light, begin, safe. Each one a lifeline. He read them slowly, tapping his fingers to the rhythm she taught him. He whispered them aloud, again and again, until the house grew quiet. And then he picked up a pencil and began to write, by himself. Meanwhile, across town, in a modest apartment above a corner laundromat, Marissa unpacked her small suitcase. She placed her mother's embroidered handkerchief on the nightstand. The silence felt heavier than usual, but when she opened her coat pocket, she found something folded there. A piece of Ethan's notebook. On it was written, in crooked but determined strokes, "I'll keep going, just like you said." She closed her eyes and smiled. "You're done here, and if you come back, I'll have you arrested." The mansion felt colder without her. Not colder like the temperature, but like something inside the walls had hardened overnight. The morning after Marissa left, the house moved as it always had. The chefs prepped breakfast, the butler checked schedules, the cleaners wiped down marble counters with citrus polish. The Callaway name glinted from brass fixtures and signature leather-bound portfolios. Everything gleamed, everything worked, but nothing felt right. Not to Ethan. He sat at the long dining table, untouched eggs cooling in front of him. The chair across from him, Marissa's usual route when setting silverware, remained empty, and he stared at it like something might still appear. No one had mentioned her. Not his father, not the staff, not even the teacher who had triggered it all. But Ethan could feel her absence like a pulse. She had been the only thing that ever made sense, and now she was gone. Because of him. Because he got better. Because he spoke. Because, for once, he didn't hide. And the truth had cost her everything. By noon, he refused his lesson. By dinner, he hadn't eaten a bite. When his father walked past the study and saw him curled up on the carpet, arms crossed over his chest, eyes vacant, Richard paused, just for a moment. "What are you doing on the floor?" Ethan didn't respond. "I asked you a question." Still, nothing. Richard stepped into the room. His shoes clicked on the hardwood. "You're sulking because the maid left?" "She didn't leave," Ethan said, barely audible. "You fired her." "I gave her a job and she stepped beyond it. She helped me." "I hired tutors, therapists, specialists," Richard snapped. "Do you know what that cost me? She's a housemaid, Ethan, not a teacher." Ethan looked up then, eyes dark but steady. "She's the only person who didn't make me feel like a mistake." The room froze in that moment. Not because of what he said, but because of how clearly he said it. There was no stammer, no panic, no words hiding behind silence, just truth. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no reply came. That night, Ethan locked his door. He turned his desk lamp on and spread out every scrap of paper Marissa had left behind. The sticky notes, the rhythm charts, the practice sheets where he learned to tap vowels and trace consonants with his breath. And he wrote. Clumsily. Imperfectly. But he wrote. Marissa sat alone in her apartment, a single lamp casting warm light over a small table cluttered with lesson materials she no longer needed. The space was quiet. Almost too quiet. She had scrubbed a bathtub that morning for another family across town. They didn't know her name. She didn't mind. But her mind wasn't on bathtubs. It was on a boy with trembling fingers and eyes too tired for 12 years old. She opened the drawer and pulled out the paper Ethan had slipped into her pocket. "I'll keep going, just like you said." She read it again, then reached for a pencil and wrote a single line underneath. "Then I will too." Back in the mansion, Ethan grew quiet, quieter than usual. He stopped asking questions in class, stopped responding at all. When the butler entered his room to bring him lunch, he found it untouched from the day before. When the cook tried to hand him fresh toast, he whispered, "Thank you," but didn't eat. When Richard came home late from a meeting and passed his son's door, he heard the sound of something breaking, then nothing at all. He entered without knocking. The lamp was overturned, the paper scraps were scattered, and Ethan sat in the middle of it all, staring straight ahead like he had gone somewhere far away. Richard stepped in. "What happened?" Silence. "Ethan." Ethan looked up slowly. His voice cracked. "She's gone because of me." "She's gone," Richard said carefully, "because she crossed a line." "No. She's gone because you never saw me." Richard blinked. "What?" "You saw a report, a problem, a failure. But she saw me. She was a maid. She was the only person who looked at me without shame." There was no scream, no storm, just that quiet declaration. And it shook Richard more than any shouting ever could. The next morning, Ethan didn't come down for breakfast. He didn't get dressed. He didn't even open his curtains. But around 11, he pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and he wrote, "Please come back. I still need to learn. I miss your words. E." Then he folded it, placed it inside an envelope, and slid it under the butler's door. Marissa was kneeling beside a window at a different house, polishing brass hinges, when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. One text. "He's not eating. He's not speaking. He left a note." "What do I do?" She stared at the message, heart thudding. Another buzz. "He asked for you." Her hands shook. Then she typed, "I'll come, but only if I teach on my terms." No reply. 10 minutes later, another message came. "Agreed. Please come." When the mansion gates opened again, Marissa stepped through quietly. No uniform, no apron, just herself. She walked past the marble columns and crystal chandeliers, past the same staff who had once whispered behind pantry doors, past the silence that had returned to every hallway, and up the stairs, to his room. She knocked once. The door opened a crack, and there he was, eyes wide, hands ink-stained. And when he saw her, really saw her, his lip trembled, and he lunged forward, wrapping his arms around her like he never had anyone before. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "No," she replied. "I'm proud of you." Downstairs, Richard stood in his study, hands folded behind his back. He watched from the window as the wind rustled through the garden. For the first time, he realized he didn't know what season it was. He didn't know what his son liked to read. Didn't know what Ethan feared at night, or what he whispered when no one else listened. But someone else had known, and he had fired her. When Marissa entered the study an hour later, she stood tall. Richard turned. "I understand if you want nothing to do with this household again," he began. "I don't care about the household," she said softly. "I care about the boy upstairs." Richard nodded once. "Then what do you need?" She stepped forward. "I teach on my terms. No interference, no tests without my consent, and no more pretending he's broken." Richard hesitated, then lowered his eyes. "All right." She turned to leave, but paused. "If you want to be part of his future," she said, "you need to unlearn the past." And then she was gone. That night, Ethan sat at his desk. Marissa handed him a new notebook. At the top, in bold block letters, she had written, "Day 1." He looked at her, confused. "We already started," he said. "No," she smiled. "That was just surviving. This is learning." He opened the first page, and together they began again, word by word, with no shame. Only permission. Just sign your name. No one expects anything more. The test came wrapped in silence. No fanfare, no speeches. Just a standard envelope slipped under Ethan's door at dawn, with his name printed in block letters and the words "Mid-Year Placement Exam" stamped across the front. He stared at it for 10 minutes before touching it. Then he peeled the flap open and pulled the papers out, page after page of tight-printed questions, blank spaces, and boxed sections marked, "Essay, do not leave blank." His hands went cold. Downstairs, the household was already humming with movement. The butler reviewed lunch menus. The assistant confirmed Richard Calloway's travel to Zurich. No one spoke of the test. No one reminded Ethan, because no one expected anything, except her. Marissa stood at the kitchen counter, rolling dough for the staff's breakfast croissants, her hands steady, but her heart pacing. She knew what day it was, had circled it on a small notepad weeks ago, in red. She had asked to sit with Ethan during the test. She had been denied. "It's a standardized evaluation," the headmaster had said. "We can't allow outside influence." But influence wasn't what Ethan needed. He just needed a room that didn't feel like judgment. At 8 a.m., the door to Ethan's study creaked open. Richard stood in the doorway, tie already knotted, coffee in hand. He didn't enter, just looked at his son sitting at the desk, shoulders slouched, pencil still untouched beside the exam. "You know what this is," he said. Ethan nodded. "You don't have to finish it," Richard added. "Just sign your name. No one expects anything more." And then he left. That was the moment Ethan realized something strange. It didn't hurt anymore, his father's doubt. It didn't sting the way it used to. Because he finally knew someone did believe in him. Someone expected everything. And that was enough. He picked up the pencil and began. The first paragraph took 17 minutes. He traced each word with his fingertip before copying it. He mouthed syllables. He paused when the letters swam and closed his eyes, tapping rhythms on the desk. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, just like Marissa had taught him. The instructions had said the test would take 2 hours. Ethan worked for 5. No one came to check on him. No one knocked, but he didn't stop. Down the street in a one-bedroom apartment, Marissa sat on her couch, eyes fixed on her phone. No calls, no texts. She wasn't worried. She was waiting. There's a difference. She opened her mother's old teaching notebook and ran her hand over the yellowed pages, tracing the same curves she had taught Ethan with. Letters as shapes, syllables as beats, sentences as breath. She whispered aloud, "He's doing it right now." And she smiled. By late afternoon, Ethan emerged from the study. His eyes were dry, his fingers sore, but in his chest was a strange feeling, weightless and warm. He handed the sealed packet to the driver who was instructed to deliver it to the testing center. Then he walked past the grand staircase, past the kitchen, into the garden. Marissa was already there, watering roses. He didn't say anything. He just sat down on the stone bench beside her and breathed. And after a while, she said quietly, "I felt you writing." He nodded. "It was hard," he said. "I know. But I didn't quit." She turned and looked at him fully, sunlight warming her face. "No, you didn't." 3 days passed. No one spoke of the test. Richard didn't ask. The school didn't call. But Ethan waited, not with dread, but with something new. Hope. The day the results arrived, it wasn't the school that called first. It was the headmaster, and he wasn't calm. He sounded stunned. "Mr. Calloway, we're reviewing the score report and we need to confirm. Ethan's score was among the top 5% in reading comprehension, critical reasoning, and structured writing." Richard was silent. He didn't just pass, the headmaster said. He excelled. Richard hung up, then stared at the envelope in his hands. His name was printed neatly on the label, but it was the name at the bottom of Ethan's last essay that stopped him. Written in the corner, just outside the lines, "Thank you, Miss Marissa." Marissa was on her lunch break when Ethan came running. Not walking, running breathless. He held the report like a trophy. "Open it," he said. She did, and there, in bold print, were the words, "Language Arts, Advanced Written Composition, Exceptional Progress." She looked at the boy before her, beaming with pride and dirt on his shoes from the garden, and she whispered, "You did this." He smiled. "We did." That night, the mansion buzzed. Richard called a private meeting with the headmaster, a pair of reporters, and 2 officials from the state's educational board. Ethan wasn't invited. Marissa wasn't mentioned. But as Richard read over the report again, his fingers stopped at the handwritten note in the corner. He stood in the doorway of his son's room long after Ethan had fallen asleep. He watched him for a long time, then turned and walked away to his study, where he opened a blank sheet of paper and began writing something he hadn't written in years. A speech. Not for investors, not for shareholders, but for his son and the woman who saved him. Is this a joke? Or did my son do this? The Calloway mansion had always been a place of precision. The clocks were synchronized to the second, the napkins folded into perfect fans. The hallway mirrors never bore a single smudge. And in the heart of that marble and glass empire stood Richard Calloway, unshaken, unapologetic, and utterly certain of the world he had built. But on a quiet Thursday morning, he stood at the head of the dining table, holding a piece of paper that made his hand tremble ever so slightly. He read it once, then again, then a third time. And still, the numbers didn't change. The results had arrived earlier that morning by courier, not email. Embossed envelope. Priority seal. Confidential. The delivery man had no idea he was holding the tremor that would loosen the foundation of the Calloway estate, Ethan's standardized placement results. But this wasn't just a pass. It was a shock. Top 5% in language comprehension. Advanced level in written expression, marked exceptional recovery trajectory by the review board. And attached to the back was a hand-signed note from the evaluator. We commend whoever worked patiently with this student. His progress is unlike anything we've seen this year. Richard stared at the last line, then turned to the final page, the handwritten essay section. He scanned Ethan's words, absorbing every carefully drawn letter. And there it was, tucked in the lower corner, so small it could have been missed. Thank you, Miss Marissa. The ink wasn't even dry when his phone began to ring. The headmaster's voice cracked like glass. Mr. Calloway, we received a copy of Ethan's scores and we need to confirm their authenticity. This is highly unusual. Unusual? Richard asked slowly. Statistically improbable, even. From near illiteracy last semester to this? Are you suggesting fraud? No, just clarification. Is there a new specialist we should credit? A program we missed? Richard was silent, then said, "There was someone," and hung up. The news spread faster than he could control. The school board emailed for permission to feature Ethan's case study at their upcoming conference. The private education group his family had donated millions to asked for an interview with the tutor behind the transformation, and 2 magazines, Elite Parenting and Forbes Next, requested comment for a story they were preparing. By noon, the staff in the mansion had already heard. He scored in the top percentile? Are they sure it wasn't a misprint? Maybe the boy's finally growing into his genes. No, someone whispered. It was the maid. The one they fired. That whisper reached the pantry, the kitchen, the hallway, the butler. And then, Ethan. He found out not from his father, but from a staff member who congratulated him with surprise and awkwardness, as if unsure if it was real. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. Instead, he ran to the garden, where Marissa was trimming a line of hedges behind the fountain. He didn't say a word, just held out the letter. She read it slowly, then looked at him. And her eyes glistened. "I knew," she said, voice catching. "But it's still beautiful to see." Ethan shifted, unsure. "I didn't think it'd be a big deal." She knelt so they were level. "Ethan, this house, this world, has spent your whole life measuring you by someone else's ruler. You just broke that ruler in half." He didn't understand every word, but he understood the feeling. Upstairs, Richard paced his study like a man trying to reconcile a ghost story with a business report. This didn't make sense. His son, his disappointing, difficult, disconnected son, had done what the professionals could not. Had succeeded not because of elite tutors, but because of a maid, because of her. And yet, the essay. He couldn't stop reading it. It wasn't just the spelling or grammar. It was the voice. Thoughtful, brave, honest. There was a line in the middle that struck him deeper than any headline. "I used to think letters hated me. Now I think maybe they just needed someone to introduce us." Richard sat down, hard, and said out loud to no one, "Is this a joke? Or did my son do this?" That evening, during dinner, Ethan sat at the table, quiet as usual. But when his father entered, something was different. Richard didn't go to his seat. He walked to Ethan's side, slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a rare bird, and placed the results on the table in front of him. "I read your essay," he said. Ethan nodded. "I don't know how you did it." Ethan hesitated, then replied, "I do." Richard waited, and Ethan added, "She taught me how to listen to myself. Not read, not write. Listen to myself." Richard swallowed hard, then did something Ethan hadn't seen in years. He sat beside him, not across, not above, beside. The next day, the Callaway press team released a statement. Richard had rewritten it himself. It read, "In recognition of an extraordinary and unconventional teaching breakthrough, the Callaway Foundation will be funding a new educational initiative for children with learning differences. The program will be named Marissa's Method. We believe brilliance does not come from pressure, but from permission." It went viral. Back in the mansion, Ethan watched from the top of the staircase as reporters began calling. Some for him, some for her. He didn't care about the cameras. He only cared about what came next. That night, when the mansion had quieted and the staff had retreated to their quarters, Ethan walked into the kitchen, barefoot, still holding the letter. Marissa stood by the sink, wiping down the counter. He walked up beside her, tugged her sleeve. She turned. He looked up at her and said quietly, "Can I call you Mama too now?" The room froze. She turned fully, eyes wet, heart breaking and blooming at the same time. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "You always could." And he leaned into her arms like it was the only home he'd ever needed. "I didn't come back to clean. I came because he called me." The gates of the Callaway estate had never opened slowly. Until now. They creaked just slightly, as if the very iron remembered who had once been sent away. But this time, she walked in not as staff, not as help, as someone summoned. The headlines had already spread across the news cycle. "The billionaire's son who couldn't read, now top of his class. Callaway heir credits former maid for his literacy breakthrough. Marissa's method gains national attention." And beneath each headline, her name appeared for the first time in print, no longer misspelled, no longer in the background. Marissa Johnson, age 32, uncredentialed, unconventional, unforgettable. Ethan had called her, not through his father, not through an assistant, but by handwriting a letter himself in neat, steady strokes. Everyone's calling now, but I only want to keep learning from you. Please come back. Not to clean, just to be here. Just to be you. Love, E. When she arrived that morning, she wore no uniform. Just a long, dark coat, boots still dusted from the subway station, and a calm so quiet it unsettled the staff more than shouting ever could. The butler opened the door and froze. She smiled. "Don't worry, I brought no mop." He stepped aside in silence. Marissa walked across the marble floor as if it were pavement, as if she had never been erased from it. And then she saw him, at the top of the staircase. Ethan, in a soft gray sweater and navy slacks, holding a book, not a math workbook or spelling list, an actual book. And he was smiling. She met him at the foot of the stairs. "Page 28, he said, tapping the book. "I read it twice." She reached for the book with both hands, and he handed it to her like a knight offering a sword. "That's a good number," she said. "It's how many days since you left?" Marissa blinked, hard, then pulled him into a hug, and for the first time since her return, let herself exhale. They sat on the library floor, backs against the bottom row of shelves, Ethan's legs stretched long in front of him. They read side by side, sometimes aloud, sometimes in whisper, each word a step, each line a landing. And for the first time, Ethan didn't stumble. But not everyone welcomed her return. Not everyone believed what was happening. Richard Calloway had said nothing since the announcement. He hadn't greeted her. He hadn't objected either. He watched and waited until the silence could no longer hold. Late that afternoon, Marissa was called to the study. Same room, same leather chair, same man behind the desk. But she didn't stand this time. She sat, uninvited, unapologetic. Richard looked at her for a long while, then said, "I underestimated you." She raised an eyebrow. "That's not surprising." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You did something no one else could, with no license, no credentials, no formal training." "And yet," she replied, "he's reading." He leaned back in his chair. "I brought in the best." "No," she said. "You brought in the loudest, the most decorated, the most expensive. None of them listened." Richard's jaw tightened. "He needed a method. You gave him emotion." "He needed permission," she corrected, "not pressure. He needed rhythm, breath, space, not just rules." He tapped a folder on his desk. "I've had 15 calls this week asking if Marissa's method can be scaled, franchised, sold." She shook her head. "You can't bottle it." "I can try." She smiled gently. "But you won't. Because deep down, you know this wasn't about strategy. It was about someone seeing your son when you didn't." The silence cut, clean and deep. Then she stood. "I didn't come back to clean," she said softly but firmly. "I came because he called me." And she left the room, with her dignity intact, and the power shifted just a little. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hedges and golden light bled through the windows, Richard stood at the edge of the garden and watched his son. Ethan was sitting on the ground, tracing words into the dirt with a stick. Marissa sat beside him, not correcting, just watching, guiding, allowing. And Richard, for once, didn't interrupt. He walked slowly over, paused, then knelt beside them. "Can I join?" he asked. Marissa said nothing. Ethan looked up, surprised. "Do you want to write something?" he asked. Richard hesitated, then took the stick and wrote a single word in the soil. "Try." Ethan grinned. "Good," he said. "Now add something." Richard added. Again Marissa smiled faintly, then took the stick. She added. Together, they looked at it, the three of them, one word at a time. Later that night, Ethan opened his new notebook, the leather one, the one Marissa gave him with no lined prompts, no checkboxes, no test dates, only blank pages. He wrote one sentence at the top of the first page. "I am not stupid." He looked at it for a long moment, then underlined it. Once, twice, then turned the page. Brilliance doesn't come from pressure. It comes from permission. The reporters came first, then the educators, then the skeptics, and finally, the hopefuls. The Callaway estate had never hosted an event like this. Not for mergers, not for product launches, not even for charity galas. But on this bright spring morning, a crowd gathered beneath a white canopy tent stretched across the garden lawn, waiting to hear a boy read. Not a prodigy, not a champion. Just a boy who had once been broken by the alphabet and rebuilt by kindness. Ethan stood behind the podium, one hand clutching his note cards, the other resting beside Marissa's. He was 12, but something in the way he breathed made him feel older, braver. The crowd quieted. The birds quieted. And then, slowly, he spoke. "I used to think words were the enemy. I used to believe I was dumb, slow, lazy, broken. But I wasn't. I was just scared. Scared of reading out loud. Scared of blank pages. Scared of my own name. Then someone listened. And that changed everything." He paused, took a breath, and glanced sideways. Marissa smiled. He nodded and continued. "I don't remember the first word I ever read, but I remember the first time it didn't hurt to read. That's what this program is about. Not tests, not speed, not labels, just learning without shame. We call it Marissa's method, but really it's just teaching the way she lives, with patience and love." He lowered the cards, looked out at the rows of educators, parents, and children, some squirming in their seats, some holding back tears, and said, "If you're out there and feel like you can't read, or like you're not enough, I just want you to know you're not alone, and you're not the problem." Silence. Then applause. Then something more. Tears. From strangers. From teachers. From Richard Callaway himself, seated in the front row with his hands trembling as he clapped. Afterward, when the guests had drifted off and the tent began to come down, Ethan sat with Marissa on the steps of the garden patio, shoes off, notebook open. The wind carried the smell of lilac and cut grass. "Do you remember the first word we practiced?" she asked, turning to him. He grinned. "River." "You kept flipping the V and the R." He laughed. "I still do sometimes." "Doesn't matter," she said. "You never stopped trying." They sat in the sunlight, both quiet for a while. Then Ethan's voice grew soft. "Why did you stay?" She turned toward him. "What do you mean?" "Even when everyone told you to stop helping me, when you got fired, why'd you come back?" Marissa looked up at the sky for a moment, then said, "Because you reminded me who I used to be." He tilted his head. "My mother helped me the same way I helped you. She told me I wasn't broken. She showed me how to feel the rhythm of words instead of fearing them. And after she died, I promised I'd give that gift to someone else. But I didn't know who. Not until I met you. Ethan didn't respond right away. Then, very slowly, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. She opened it. It was his adoption request. Not legal, just personal. Handwritten in pencil, careful and nervous. Dear Miss Marissa, I know I already have a dad, and I know I'm not little anymore, but if I could choose who helped raise me, it would have been you. So even if we can't make it real on paper, I want you to know, in my heart, you are my mama too. Forever. Marissa's breath caught in her throat. The breeze lifted the edge of the page, as if the wind itself wanted to read it. She folded the letter back with trembling hands, then leaned forward and pressed a kiss to his forehead. You've always been mine, she whispered. From the first time you gripped that pencil like it owed you something. Later that evening, Richard approached them as they were sipping warm tea under the trees. He looked different now, still tall, still pressed, still polished, but softer, as if some armor had finally cracked and let in light. He cleared his throat. I've been speaking with the board, he said. They want to expand Marissa's method into other districts, especially underserved schools. Marissa nodded. That's good. I also spoke to your old principal, he added. The one who expelled you at 14. She raised an eyebrow. He regrets it, Richard said. She smiled. I'm sure he does. Ethan chuckled. Richard looked at them both for a long time. Then, almost awkwardly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small silver box. He handed it to her. Marissa opened it. Inside was a custom-engraved necklace, a simple silver pendant. It read, Permission, not pressure. Richard spoke quietly. You gave that to him, and somehow, to me too. Marissa didn't answer. She just closed the box and nodded. That night, as the moon rose over the Calloway estate, Ethan sat at his desk, the same one where he once cried over a backward bee. He now wrote freely, pages of stories, thoughts, dreams. He didn't worry about spelling, or grammar, or neatness. He just let it flow. Because now he knew the truth. Learning wasn't about perfection. It was about becoming. And he had become something more than his grades, more than his name, more than his diagnosis. He had become a voice. And behind that voice was a woman who refused to stay silent. Somewhere, a boy still struggles with letters. Somewhere, a girl still hides during reading time. Somewhere, a child still believes they are stupid. But maybe, just maybe, their Marissa is coming. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If Ethan and Marissa's journey moved you, reminded you of someone you love, or gave you hope, please consider sharing it. Every view, every comment, every share helps keep stories like this alive. And if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated, know this. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And sometimes it only takes one person to believe in you, to change everything. We'll see you in the next story.